Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted and privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from San Francisco, USA, Mr. Jonathan Brill. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ash. It's amazing to be here.
Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to chatting.
Thank you. Jonathan is a Fortune 50 futurist. He's a speaker, a trusted advisor, and a serial inventor. And he's an author. And all of you know I'm very, very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled Rogue Waves, Future-Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. Inc. magazine has called him a Silicon Valley legend. Harvard Business Review refers to him as the world's leading transformation architect. And Jonathan is an expert on radical change, how to create, take advantage, and get ahead. My goodness, what an amazing set of things you've been doing, Jonathan. So before we come to your book, tell me a little bit about your own amazing journey.
So about 20 years ago, I started running product innovation firms. We did a lot of work in real estate, so theme park rides, World's Fair pavilions, museum exhibits, that sort of thing. Things where we were taking technology and built environments and putting them together. We designed an LED sign to go on top of a major building in Times Square in New York at one point. The second thing we did, and there's some kind of double entendre, this idea of being a serial inventor. We had a food studio, so we developed thousands of ideas for new food products for the world's largest FCPG firms. And then we had a studio that dealt with technology, with cyber physical systems. How do you take software, hardware, bring them together for the Sony, Verizon, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM. Sorry, Amazon was not in that list, but you get the idea.
Yep.
The about 7 years ago, HP called me, said, "We want you to be our global futurist." And I said, "Okay." And I thought I was going to be their product guy. I was going to come in and come up with their future product vision. And I got in and realized what they needed was like a global intelligence agency so that they could make better long-term decisions about things they had to do today. How do they make sure the decisions they make today have better results tomorrow? So we did that for a number of years and helped them through a transformation. And then I took some time to write this book called Rogue Waves, How to Survive and Profit from how future-proof your business to survive and profit from radical change.
Wonderful. And we're
so that's what I've been doing. I'm advising a range of organizations, startups, governments, some large organizations on how to really make sure that in our time of increasing disruption, that you have a better future tomorrow than you do today.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So, Jonathan, let's talk about your book, Rogue Waves, Future-Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. And before I ask any questions about your book, I'm going to ask all my viewers and listeners to go and check out Jonathan Brill's book on Amazon and other platforms. I'm going to go and check it out myself. So tell me a little bit about your book and what was your hypothesis when you started to write it?
So when we plan for the future, we typically look at, there's this trend that demographics are going to change or the market's going to change or there's going to be inflation. But what we fail to do repeatedly is ask what happens when these things collide. In the deep ocean, you can see these 120-foot tall walls of water that pop up out of nowhere. They're called rogue waves.
Correct.
When individually manageable waves of change, collide. And the same thing happens in business. The same thing happens in life. And so I believe the question that we need to ask as leaders, as business leaders, is instead of how do we avoid these and how do we hide from them? How do we duck under them? How do we take advantage of them? Because it turns out that companies that are set up to take advantage of them, and this is based on if you're a geek, cross-sectoral 2000 company 13-year or 14-year study from McKinsey, the companies that do this have 82% higher economic profits over time.
Okay.
The thing is that, you've been an executive, I'm compensated. I'm being told to make decisions on a 1 year, 2 year, maybe 5 year basis. If you're the CEO, maybe 7. So you don't care about what happens 14 years out. The problem is that, at least in the US, there have been about over the 20th century, there were about 4 major business shocks a year. About every 7 years, those collided to create a rogue wave.
Correct.
Pandemic, world war, monetary regime change, inflationary explosion, energy shock, you name it, right? These things happen repeatedly. And they take about 3 years to dig out of, right? We see the pandemic, we're 3 years into it, we're starting to dig out of it. This is how these things work. And so if you assume that there are going to be, on average, 2 of these cycles in your 14-year period, all of a sudden this thing that seems so random out there, like we're going to have 82% higher growth, is a lot less random when you consider the second fact that in British American tobacco, relatively mature business, right? Your peer competitors know what they're doing, you know what you're doing. And it's very Michael Porter, traditional strategy problem.
Correct.
Until there's a major supply chain disruption. And one competitor can deliver and the other competitor can't. Well, what happens in that moment if the competitor that can deliver is able to, is that they come out of that trough about 38% faster. And they tend to sustain that market share. Right. So we have this crazy situation where, for many companies and many industries, the real growth, that 82% higher economic profits over a 14-year period, it actually happens in a couple of times of disruption where there's a spike in opportunity and then that opportunity is sustained. And so as leaders, we need to stop thinking of disruption, of rogue waves, as these events we can't predict, as these events that we'll handle when we get there, and start thinking about these as our best friends.
Fascinating. Thank you. My next question is that how can businesses balance the need to focus on short-term goals while also preparing for long-term changes?
Well, this is always the argument, right? Well, my incentives aren't aligned with what we should be doing, or we can't really plan for the future, or we don't really know when that thing will happen. But I would argue that that's lazy. That we can look at the future. And we try and imagine, we see this explosion of artificial intelligence. I'm not saying this is true, but there was a article in an archive about GPT-4 that came out today saying, hey, maybe this is in fact the inner edge, the beginning edge of artificial general intelligence. Not arguing that's true.
Correct.
But we're starting to have that conversation. Right. So what we need to be thinking about isn't like, what does that mean for my business? What does that future look like with rocket ships, artificial general intelligence, and just the science fiction future? What we need to be thinking about, at least at first, is what would happen if a decade like any decade of the 20th century happened again to my company, right? So imagine a world where in a decade period, a major rising power takes over a Pacific island chain. There is a breakthrough in biotech that radically increases the delivery of food supplies around the world. We're able to another breakthrough that allows us to 4 times increase the food carrying capacity of the world. And there's a machine that changes the way we do global transportation. Well, this was in fact the world from 1900 to 1910.
Correct.
U.S. takes over a major Pacific island chain,
Mm.
air conditioning, refrigeration. We see the explosion of the development of nitrogen fixing, which enables fertilizer, and we see the aircraft.
Mm.
Right. That can happen in a decade, and that can happen in a decade like in 1900.
Correct.
If you believe the world's moving faster today, we should expect more disruption today than a decade like that.
Well said.
So what does that look like for you? So when we plan for the future, right, we can talk about the future. We can talk about all of these science fiction things that can happen. But first consider the futures that have already happened.
Correct.
The past. Because I guarantee you're not ready for those either. And we can, as a rational, performance-oriented, dividend-driven organization, justify planning against that.
Very interesting. You also state, Jonathan, that businesses need to think beyond their immediate industry or sector and pay attention to a broader societal and technological trend or trends. Can you give me some examples of how this has played out in practice?
Yeah. So I believe what you're saying is that I make an argument in the book, and we did about $15 million of research over a 3-year period to understand what are those major changes that will happen in the next decade, from 2020 to 2030. Some of them are playing out pretty dramatically and pretty accurately. I break them down into 3 buckets: social trends, economic trends, and technological trends. And so when I look at it, I start thinking about economics, changing demographics. So in terms of college level education, high skill education, between now and 2030, there will be a massive shortage of people with 4-year or equivalent degrees worldwide. India is the only country that will have excess capacity. It will have about the ability to backfill the state of California in the United States. So just to give a sense of scale, everyone else is going to have a shortage.
Wow.
So when we think about these larger economic trends, right, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to automate non-critical tasks so that the people who are able to do that kind of work have the ability to do the high value aspects of their jobs? And so when we think about things like artificial intelligence, so we talked about an economic issue, we think about things like artificial intelligence. I think we misunderstand the goal and the role of this in the workplace. Yes, there will be massive automation. I believe that we think after 15 years we've digitally transformed our firms. I think we haven't even started yet.
Correct.
And what does that look like? Because if you have the types of shortages that I'm talking about, you have to automate anything that is not a decision task that could be done by a machine to free up these people to do the labor they should and should want to be doing. What's the social implication of this? We're going to see probably a relatively limited number of companies with the data center capacity start to consolidate massive amounts of power. You're going to see that there's a limited number of people who can build these systems, and that your organization probably can't afford them. So we're going to be building on top of API layers. Who owns that software in the middle will be really interesting. If you'd asked me 3 years ago, the idea that Microsoft would be licensing OpenAI from a startup,
correct,
like that was not something that was on my list, and that it would be a startup that was originally co-funded by Amazon that didn't reinvest. That also wouldn't have been on my list. So when you take a look at these social and economic things, they're going to have, I'm sorry, these technological and economic things, they're going to have massive social impact too, right? What happens to the people who aren't able to catch on to this radical change in how we do things quickly enough? What happens to the people who never had access to the markets, who never had access to the cognitive skills to really take advantage of them?
Correct.
How do we deal with that? So we're going to have a really interesting relationship between people, business, government, how they come together, how they collide in the next decade. It's going to have to happen.
Well said. And then my follow-up question, and what you just said is an interesting segue to the next question, which is you also discussed the importance of collaboration and partnerships between businesses to tackle shared challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about this and give me some examples of successful collaboration?
So I think what we were talking about is the beginning of that. Correct. That we're going to see two things. One, businesses that aren't able to sustain differentiation will have problems in a world of automation, right? Two, that we're going to see things that used to be high skill become low skill. So there was a chat GPT hack, and who knows how many times they had to try this for it to work on you on video. Because in video the demo only has to work once. But there was a thing the other day where a guy draws a picture of a website that makes a joke, and so you can go and put in ask it to make a punchline, or put in a punchline, and then it'll tell you what the setup is, or the other way around. Super simple like idea. But he literally draws a picture on a piece of paper of this. He takes a picture of it, and the AI tool, GPT-4 rather, gives him the code to make the website with all of the stuff to make all of the jokes. Right. Yes. Well, that's a lot of people's labor that like a week ago would have had to go into doing that.
Yeah.
A couple of people's labor, just automated. So within that were a body of people who had written jokes, a machine learning tool to figure out how to use that to write new jokes, all sorts of little bits of code that had been developed by multiple organizations over time, Open and AI putting this thing together. I don't know if that specific demo sat on top of Bing, which is Microsoft's search engine. And then this startup company that's going to make a joke website generator, right? All of these organizations had to work together, or would have to work together, to make this work, to deal with the copyright issues, to deal with the technology issues, to deal with the data center upon which this would sit, to write the code, to commercialize the product, to market the product. And yet at the front end, right, some guy drew a picture and then had a business.
Very interesting.
And that's how things are going to increasingly work. That person at the front end who drew that picture, he didn't have to understand any of these things under his
absolutely. Yeah, I remember reading something with ChatGPT on its own said, these are the 20 or 40 jobs I will be able to do without any problems. And that created a bit of a scare amongst a lot of young people. I had someone called me and said that. But Jonathan, you also talk about the importance of businesses being able to anticipate and adapt to radical change. How do you define radical change? Is it the seventh wave, every seventh wave, or is it more? And can you give me some examples?
Yeah. So when I think about my book, Rogue Waves, and this idea of the rogue wave, that the individually manageable waves of change can collide to create a radical and different outcome. I believe we're moving into a world of much more disruption than the last 40 years, than your and I professional life. All of the indicators are there to suggest that. And you can manage this in one of two ways. You can either try to mitigate risk, right, and just kind of have reliable growth. But in a world where demographics are changing, which is going to slow what's called structural growth in many parts of the world, not necessarily India, but in many parts of the world, China, the US, likely Europe, we're going to have to figure out how to find our growth in these moments of disruption, in these moments of radical change. And when you take a look at, coming out of World War I, coming out of World War II, coming out of the the energy shocks of the 1970s and deregulation in the United States in the 1980s, what you see is that an entirely new the semiconductor era. What you see is in each of these moments of disruption, an entirely new set of winners were minted. And so the question isn't how do you step back from these moments of disruption? It's how do you take advantage of them? Because that is the real opportunity, especially when you see slowing structural growth.
Fascinating. I have time for two more questions, Jonathan. My next question is probably a little more general, that based on all your research and all the work that you've done with so many different businesses, and given the fact that you've spoken at length about rogue waves, what advice would you give to businesses that are just starting out or trying to pivot their business model in response to changes in their market? And this would be primarily for a very large number of the startups who will listen to our conversation.
Yeah. So what I found with my book, because what I did was big business planning. I do stuff for governments, is that there's this very weird division in my readers. There are, military officers, senior military officers, and there are 22-year-old startup CEOs who are trying to figure out how to do this stuff and realizing that what they learned in business school is not relevant in the world of radical change, because what they learned in business school was about the world becoming more harmonized, because about the world of relatively smooth growth trajectories that we've seen in Ash, your and my lifetime. In a world of sustained disruption, the opportunity is understanding the range of what's possible and figuring out how you're going to lean into it, letting luck stop being chance and letting luck stop being fate, and building the skills to make that possible, to make it sustained, to make it strategic in your business and in your life. And I think that's where we need to go. That's how we need to think. And it comes back to a lot of the things we were talking about earlier, right? How do you look at the range of what's happened, not in your career or your parents' career, but over the last couple of 100 years, and ask, are you ready for that? Look at changes in the environment that we know will happen, right? We know that we will continue to see massive automation. We know that we will continue to see growing resource challenges, growing resource conflicts. We know that the relationship between society, governments, and businesses will continue to have to re-evolve as a result of these shifts. So what are those social, economic, and technological changes in your business and in your life? And in the book, Rogue Waves, we give you just an overview of what those things probably look like. But you're going to have to dig in a little deeper and say, okay, well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my business?
Right.
And once again, in the book, we give you lots of tools to turn those dials and figure that out for yourself. And so I think that's why, like I said, I'm seeing these senior officers who are trying to teach these skills to their people.
Mm.
And at the same time, I'm seeing these startup CEOs, or startup leaders who are trying to figure out, okay, how do I take advantage of this change
Mm.
instead of becoming subservient to it?
Mm. Amazing. And my last question to you, Jonathan, this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. And as I mentioned, a very large number of them are young. Um, Based on your amazing understanding of business, of the future, based on all the research that you've done, what would you say are three lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your journey and from our conversation?
Becoming resilient to the
Hmm.
future,
Hmm.
uh, learning how to take advantage of it on purpose
Hmm.
requires three things.
Hmm.
One, an awareness of what can be, the
Yeah.
range of what is possible.
Hmm.
Two, the behaviors and the skills to take advantage of it.
Hmm.
And three, a culture where you're able to have conversations
Hmm.
about things we do not yet fully know, things for which there is not yet enough evidence
Hmm.
to fully justify the conversation.
Hmm.
Because when you do those things, you can have real conversations about the future,
Hmm.
not just business as you have seen it, but business as it will be.
Hmm.
And when you do that, so few companies really do this effectively. But when you do that and you do it with rigor,
Hmm.
you are ready for the next rogue wave. You are ready for the next disruption. And
Hmm.
you have the skills within your organization
Hmm.
to take advantage of it.
Hmm. Wow. And on that note, Jonathan, and you're so much detailing about rogue waves. I think what you've really taught me is to keep watching out for the next rogue wave, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners have really understood how important it is for us to be able to really tackle the uncertainties that we will be faced with. And in our times, I think the time that we normally have, which used to be available to us much longer, is no longer so available. I used to be able to procrastinate, but today, in the today's technology, things, we don't have the luxury of time as much as we used to in my boomers generation. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for speaking to me about your book, Rogue Waves. And thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects of business. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.